You are listening to The Faithful Father, Pemberton Manor, Book 3, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Chapter 1. He'd thought it was a cruel joke. "I want to see you," the note had read. It had been slipped under his door sometime over the holidays while he'd been out of town. "I'll be back tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, until you open your door to me." But Harvey knew better. His son would never have written those words, because his son could hardly speak, no less write coherently. His son couldn't walk or drive, or even leave his room without help. His son couldn't see anything, even if he wanted to, because he was blind. And if, by some miracle, he wasn't, it wouldn't change things. August wouldn't want to see his father. But everything about the handwriting, from the backward tilt of the letters indicative of a lefty to the dramatic downward slash of the I, it was familiar enough to keep Harvey from crumpling the thing up and tossing it into the trash. The signature, too. It wasn't quite the same. The A was askew somehow. But the T? August crossed his T with a flourish every time he signed his name, as though he wielded a rapier instead of a pen. If he didn't know better, Harvey would have sworn the signature was his son's. Harvey had slept fitfully that night, waking every couple of hours to stare at the paper on his nightstand, memorizing the phone number without even realizing it. 5 a.m. had come all too quickly, and his bleary eyes with their sandpaper lids had worked better than any scratchy hair shirt to remind him of all the reasons he paid penance these days. He'd thought about that note every day, every hour, practically every waking moment since finding it. At the shop, behind the wheel, between sips of morning coffee, over whatever takeout meal he ate at the end of the day. At first, he'd found himself pausing outside his apartment door, his heart pounding, wondering if he'd find another folded scrap of paper on the floor inside. And every time he pushed the door open to find nothing there, a wave of emotion he didn't want to define settled like a millstone around his neck. At night, in the murky darkness of his bedroom, he'd begun to pray again. "Please, God, please." He had no other words to express the well of emotions that had been tapped. He'd spent so long in silence and stillness, not allowing himself to hope, to feel, especially not to pray. He wasn't even sure what he was asking for, or if the man upstairs would deign to hear him, no less answer him. The plea welled up in him none the less. But in almost 2 months, there'd been no other communication from August, no new attempt to connect, no evidence that the note had been anything but a joke. "Hey, Harv," his boss called out to him from across the shop, drawing him out of his reverie. "I just got a call from Tom," Ernie continued, approaching with a weary shuffle. "He's on his way in and needs you to take a look at his radiator. Had to fill it twice on the last home stretch. You want to stick around, work some overtime, and take a look? He's got another run in the morning if you can clear him." Ernie lifted his faded Dodgers ball cap and scratched at his bald spot on the back of his head. His expression revealed his frustration, and Harvey couldn't blame him. Tom seemed to have a knack for heading out in a smooth-running rig and rolling back in on a wing and a prayer, with ominous billows of smoke or knocking sounds emitting from under the hood. "I can do that." Harvey slid a wrench into its slot in his toolbox. "Starting to dread picking up his calls," Ernie grumbled. He held out a clipboard. "I'll need you to sign this." "Job security," Harvey grunted, tugging a grimy rag from his back pocket to wipe his hands before taking the work order. Ernie chuckled, but his grin was only half-cocked, and the mirth didn't reach his eyes. "Job security for you, maybe, but for Tom? I'd say liability better suits. I swear the kid is starting to cost us more than he's bringing in." Tom, however, wasn't really to blame. As the rookie driver on the crew, he was still proving his mettle, which meant that he got stuck with the worst clients and the loads no one else wanted. He also got stuck with the trucks no one else wanted, which explained why it was always his rig breaking down. In fact, if Ernie really wanted to get to the bottom of things, he might do well to look at his mechanic instead of his drivers. It was Harvey's job to keep things running, and although he was as dependable as the day was long, Harvey didn't always know when to throw in the towel. The ancient rig Tom drove was held together with little more than baling wire and duct tape these days, and really should have been put out to pasture a while ago. But Tom was one of those young men who always had a smile and a handshake for everyone, who took the reject runs without complaining, and even though he hobbled in as often as not, he was always ready to go again the next day. Liability he may be, but he was also an asset to the company. With an attitude and a work ethic like his, Tom had great potential if only he could get a good set of wheels under him. "I'll have her ready," Harvey assured Ernie. He already knew what was wrong with the truck. Corrosion was a constant plague with older cooling systems, and the radiator cap needed to be replaced. It required an extra hard crank to seal well, and although he'd warned Tom about it, the fact remained that the part was shot. Harvey hoped he'd be able to find one in stock at a local parts store. He made a mental note to order a couple of the older radiator caps to have in his own stock, especially if he was going to keep Tom's truck on the road for much longer. 2 hours tops, Ernie said. Any more than that, Tom gets benched so you can work on it during regular hours. Harvey nodded and handed Ernie back the clipboard, complete with his illegible signature. He had none of August's dramatic flair. He wouldn't need 2 hours for the fix, but he wouldn't rush through it either. Anything to keep from having to go back to his airless apartment at the end of the day. By the time Harvey made his way home, Tom's rig was ready for another delivery, and Harvey had clocked less than an hour of overtime. He took his time locking up, shot the breeze for a few minutes with the new security guy, Lou, and shuffled out to his Blazer, a fairly ancient rig itself, with its boxy shape and two-tone blue and white paint job. It sounded old school with its rumbling growl, but it ran like a dream, and everything under the hood was clean as a whistle. "Burrito, burger, or Chinese," he muttered, as he settled in behind the wheel and slid his key into the ignition. He was too tired to give it much thought, too tired to even have a preference. He was always tired these days, it seemed. "Burrito it is," he informed himself, knowing the drive-through Mexican food stand might not be the quickest option, but it was the heartiest. 15 minutes later, he unfolded his lanky form from behind the wheel, scooped up his brown paper bag of food, and locked up the Blazer behind him. The tangy scent of salsa and chili relleno mingled with the bite of engine oil and fuel that clung to his work clothes as he hurried across the small residential parking lot toward the front of the apartment building. It was cold, even for February in Southern California, the murky sky a reflection of his own spirit, and Harvey drew the collar of his jacket up to shield his neck from the bite in the wind. He grimaced at the slish-slash of the cheap nylon fabric loud in his ears. As he punched in the code at the front door of the apartment building, he fumbled a little, nearly dropping his dinner bag. "Let me help you." The voice was bright and cheerful, completely out of place in Harvey's gray world. Chapter 2. The girl grew in stature before his widening eyes as she leapt up the concrete steps, nearly running into him in her effort to catch his burrito. He tensed for the impact, but she pulled up just short of plowing into him and flashed him a wide, disarming smile. She wore blue jeans and a padded vest over a red plaid shirt, and high-top canvas shoes on her feet, an outfit that reminded Harvey of the stuff August used to wear, at least back in his high school years. Her hair, pulled back into a messy bun on top of her head, made her appear taller than she was. It added an extra 2 or 3 inches to her already above-average height. She seemed to tower over him, but he straightened his drooping shoulders to meet her gaze. "Thank you, but I've got it," he began, holding the bag up as proof. "Just clumsy at the end of the day." He reached for the door handle, pausing when she laughed. "Ha, me too, except that I'm clumsy all day. I mean, I about took you out just then. Thank goodness I'm wearing my Chuck Taylors and not the heels I had on earlier today, or we both would have been down for the count." She stepped back, and Harvey thought he actually felt the air around him clear a little. It had been a long time since he'd stood so close to a woman, and this one smelled like the cherry pies his wife used to bake for him. It wasn't just her smile that was disarming, he realized. The internal mechanism on the coded lock clicked loudly, and Harvey pushed the large front door open, holding it wide. "Are you coming in?" "I am," the girl said, sweeping past him and turning to walk backwards so she could look at him. "I'm here visiting my sister on the 3rd floor. You know Sarah Winters, don't you?" "Sarah, she's the teacher, right?" Harvey nodded as he stepped clear of the door to let it swing closed behind them. He subconsciously listened for the clunk of the lock as he eyed the girl before him. Perhaps she was, as she claimed, Sarah's sister. Something about the tilt of the eyes and the wide smile made him nod to himself. But she was at least half a foot taller than the young teacher upstairs, who was no petite thing either. "I've met her, yes. She's a fine young lady." The girl's shoes squeaked on the linoleum floor, and when she tripped over the barely there threshold that led from the small entryway into the main floor lobby, he grabbed for her to keep her from landing on her backside, catching her hand in his. He hoped he'd done a decent job of washing the grease from his before leaving work. "I totally agree," she said, as though he hadn't just saved her from disaster. She didn't let go of his hand, either. "I'll be sure and tell her you said so." She stopped walking, much to Harvey's relief, and shook his hand firmly before finally releasing it. "I'm Grace Winters, and I, unlike my model citizen sister, have yet to find a job I like well enough to allow others to identify me by it." She shrugged, as if her words meant little to her, but Harvey thought perhaps the opposite was true. "But I really, really like her, and I'm always proud to be associated with her. So for now, think of me as the teacher's sister." Harvey let out a tired chuckle. "A pleasure to meet you, Grace Winters, teacher's sister. Harvey Jones here, 2nd floor. I'm a mechanic. I work on big rigs." "Wow, you..." She cleared her throat, her eyes wide. "You work on big rigs. That's so cool." The awe in the girl's response made it sound like he'd just said he worked on Magic Pumpkin coaches, not broken-down semis. They moved across the lobby, past the wall of postal boxes. He didn't feel like checking his mail right now. He'd do it in the morning on the way out, and toward the stairs. "I can't stand the elevator," Harvey said by way of explanation. "I already knew that, but don't worry. I'm not a big fan of that thing myself." Grace gestured with a wave toward the ancient crank-operated Otis elevator. "Got stuck in it on Christmas Eve for almost 2 hours, so I'm good with the stairs." She moved in to step beside him. "Besides, now I'll have company part of the way up." Harvey stopped and turned to eye her with a furrowed brow. "Have we met before?" he asked, knowing he sounded wary, but she was, after all, a little overwhelming. "How would you know that?" "My sister told me. She's one of those people who can get anyone to do just about anything, which makes her a good teacher, you understand. She even got me to try the elevator, and I have some pretty crazy fear issues. But because things, well, they just kinda happened to me, the one time I give in to her powers of persuasion, of course the thing malfunctions." 2 hours? Harvey asked, appalled. "Did you call management? The kid in the garage apartment, Sean? He's supposed to keep that thing running." Grace waved 2 fingers in front of him. "Yep, almost 2 hours. And yes, we did call Sean. He was at a Christmas party and in no condition to help us. There were 5 of us stuck on that thing while we waited for help to come." Her cheerful smile was at complete odds with the details she was sharing. But those 2 hours were gold, I must say. Pure gold. Maybe not at first. We all had to be bitter for a while, right? But I was loaded to the gills with my mom's home cooking. I was taking it upstairs to my sicko sister, and we decided to have us a Christmas Eve feast right there on the floor of that elevator. "You're kidding." Harvey frowned, sounding as though he didn't quite believe her. No, he amended to himself. Somehow he did believe her. He just didn't understand her, he realized. "How did you get out? Sean finally show up?" "No." Grace put a hand on his arm, the familiar gesture getting his hackles up. "It was a little weird, but kinda cool. We got on and got stuck as complete strangers. Then, after forcing us to become friends and share a meal together, the elevator released us. Serendipity, you know?" He snorted dismissively. He didn't believe in such nonsense. He had no reason to, and every reason not to. "Still sounds like a rotten way to spend Christmas Eve to me." He started toward the stairs again. "One more reason you won't catch me on that thing." "That's what I told Sarah. She said you were the only one in the building she knew who wouldn't get on it. Told me you were a stairs man like me." She snickered behind her hand. "Well, I'm not a man." "I see. No, you're not." He took a few more steps, then paused at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on the rail. He had just realized that the emotion he'd mistaken as awe a moment ago when he'd told Grace about his work was actually surprise and stunned recognition. What exactly had Sarah told Grace Winters about him? Surely it wasn't just that he preferred the stairs to the Otis. That alone wouldn't have sent the girl into a mini state of shock. He shook his burrito bag. He wasn't up for this right now. "It's been a long day and I'm hungry." It sounded like a dismissal, even though he hadn't really meant it to come out that way. Had he? But Grace didn't seem to notice. "Of course you are, and my sister's waiting for me too. It's girls' movie night and I'm late as usual. Let's go. I promise I can keep up with you." Without warning, she stepped forward, slid her hand into the crook of his arm, and started to steer them both up the first flight of stairs. "Do you believe in coincidence, Harvey? Or should I call you Mr. Jones?" Harvey wanted to pull away from her. He wanted to disengage, to go to his apartment, eat his burrito, shower, and go to bed. That's what he wanted to do. He had no desire whatsoever to have this strange, disjointed conversation with this strange, perhaps somewhat disjointed Amazonian woman. He certainly didn't want to respond to her baited inquiry about all that woo-woo stuff, so instead he focused on the easier of her 2 questions. "Just call me Harvey." "Right. Harvey it is then. So?" She nudged him companionably with her elbow. "Coincidence? Fate? What about serendipity?" He was glad he wasn't a frail old man. Grace wasn't just tall. She was what he might call solid, although he'd never say so out loud, especially not to her face. Not that it wasn't a compliment. By his thinking, it was. Like most men he knew, He actually appreciated a woman with her kind of healthy glow, her full curves and rounded features, the markedly feminine form of her in spite of the genderless clothes she wore. But by some twist of fate, Grace had not been named for her light-footedness. Even a gentle nudge from her had made him do a quick side shuffle. He adjusted his stride, just in case she wasn't finished trying to physically goad him into talking about ethereal nonsense. She seemed pretty determined to get a response from him. Best give her something to chew on so he could get back to his apartment unscathed, where he could chew on his dinner. Coincidence, yes. There are too many people in this world for coincidences not to happen. But serendipity, that other stuff, not so much. Oh, Harvey, really? You don't believe in fortunate accidents? Good coming from bad? Never had much good fortune when it comes to accidents, he said with finality as they approached the landing. This is my stop. Right, okay. Grace looked like she wanted to say more, but wasn't sure where to begin after his deflating comment. Finally, she said, I'll walk you to your door. It's all right, he said, touching the brim of his cap in goodbye. Your sister is waiting for you, remember? Grace took a deep breath and nodded. You're right. Okay. Then she stuck out her hand. It really was good to meet you, Harvey. I'm glad to be able to put a face to a name. Harvey's gut instinct told him she knew a lot more about him than just his name and face, and it didn't sit comfortably with him. But he was ready to put this encounter behind him. Nice to meet you too, Grace. Say hello to your sister for me. He shook her hand firmly, then pushed open the door to the second-floor hallway. See you around, he added over his shoulder. Definitely, Grace said emphatically before the door closed behind him. Chapter 3. Harvey didn't bother pausing outside his apartment except to unlock the door. He shoved through it, glancing at the floor more out of habit than in the hopes of finding another note. The odd run-in with Grace Winters had him feeling a little off his game. He took his time hanging his coat up, using the bathroom, washing the remains of the workday from his hands and face, trying to sink back into the usual routine of his life. His days were rote, never changing, never ending, same old day in and day out. Except for an hour or two of overtime now and then, or a delivery breakdown that required him to go rescue a rig, his life had become like one of those mind-numbing white noise channels he skipped over on cable. Holidays weren't any different than other days, except for the extra pay when he worked them, but he didn't see that either. He sent everything he made above and beyond his basic living expenses to his sister Pam and her husband Will to help provide for August's care, which was why he'd been gone on Christmas Eve and well into the following week. He'd been available to go do a major repair on a breakdown in Nevada, one that had taken him several days longer than expected to complete since he had to work around holiday hours of the local hardware and parts stores. He'd returned the last day of the year to an apartment that smelled like the trash needed to be taken out, and a carton of soured milk in the fridge. And the note. Just one note. He'd been too unsettled after reading the message to go grocery shopping so he could cook himself a meal. He'd gone out for tacos that night and had brought them home, along with a 6-pack of beer to help settle his nerves. But by the time the new year was being joyously rung in by everyone around him, Harvey was awake and alone in his bed, the darkness weighing down on him like a lead blanket, sleep eluding him even in his weary, half-drunk state. Whoever had left the note had not been back, at least not during the hours that Harvey was home, and he knew instinctively the more time that went by, the less likely it was that the sender would return. That was okay with Harvey. He'd gotten used to things the way they were. At least he knew August was well loved and well cared for, although Pam had stopped giving him details about his son's progress. She'd finally put her foot down around the holidays last year. "If you want to know how August is doing, you need to ask him yourself," she'd informed him, her slender arms crossed in a posture of frustration and suppressed anger. He'd refused to take that step, so she backed off, writing him a thank you card and a short, vague update on August whenever Harvey sent money. He knew she'd let him know if things got worse, but otherwise Pam wrote things like, "August is doing really well with his new therapy program. He has good days and bad days, but his progress is consistent. We're very proud of him, as we know you are too." Empty words that mocked him, prodded him, goaded him to reach out to his son. But he couldn't. He just couldn't. Because the last thing August remembered about the night of the accident was Harvey's flying fist. It wasn't the last thing Harvey remembered. No, in his mind, he saw the whole thing play out in slow motion, a movie on automatic replay, over and over. His fist shooting out as if controlled by some external force, August's eyes widening in realization of what was coming. Harvey's knuckles meeting the rigid lines of his son's face, the way the flesh of August's cheek squished up to force his eyes shut on impact. He saw the impossible side-to-side swing of August's lower jaw, his full lips so like his mother's, flapping open to expose square white teeth completely out of alignment before the jaw righted itself. The spittle and blood, oh God, the blood, flying out of his mouth in splattering drops across the butterscotch-colored dashboard. Harvey's fist falling away, his own eyes in the rearview mirror wide with horror, and August turning back to look at him, the same look of shock and fear in his eyes, but his mouth sagging open, hands flying up to clutch at his face. And then suddenly, the dog was there in the headlights, and Harvey swerved, both hands on the wheel, cranking hard, harder, too hard to the right. Like the dog, the tree seemed to appear out of nowhere, and no matter how hard he tried to steer clear of it, even in slow motion, it all happened too fast. Less than a block from home, Harvey plowed his car up onto the sidewalk and fishtailed into the massive trunk of a centuries-old cork oak, the impact sending August's head smashing into the passenger side window. The sound of it reverberated in Harvey's ears like nothing he'd ever heard before, and nothing he could put into words, even if he wanted to. As he watched, for just one eternal moment, Harvey couldn't tell if August's skull had caved in or if the glass gave way. And then there was silence. Deadly, heart-stopping, soul-crushing silence, before he started calling his son's name over and over and over again. It took another eternity to free himself from his seatbelt, but Harvey lurched across the console to get to his son, afraid to touch him, afraid not to. His beloved August, who slumped forward in his seat, limp and unresponsive, his shoulder strap cradling him against the shattered window. So much blood. Like a switch had been flipped, sounds poured in around him, voices from outside the car, running feet, calling, shouting, a child crying. And then sirens, loud and ominous, promising help and hope, or finality and despair. It wasn't until someone opened his door that Harvey felt his own pain, a hot poker inside his leg where his shin should be. He looked down to find his foot wedged at an odd angle between the brake and clutch pedals, his toes pointing one way, his knee another. "Take care of my son first," he bellowed, fear and shock driving adrenaline through his system. "Oh, please, my son. Help August. I'm okay." But a separate team was already prying open the passenger side door, so Harvey let the two young men at his side brace his leg and assist him out of the car onto a gurney. He refused to lie flat. "I need to see! I need to see!" he insisted over and over again, until they propped the headrest up and angled the gurney so he could watch the other paramedics maneuver August's lifeless body out onto a gurney of his own and into a waiting ambulance. Harvey had begged to ride along with him, but they'd refused, explaining that August needed the undivided attention of a full crew. Harvey, impotent and emptied out, had watched helplessly as the screaming vehicle carrying his son, dead or alive, disappeared from sight. He recalled vividly the hushed quality of the ride to the hospital. He was certain the paramedics tending to his injuries knew something about August they weren't telling him. Then came the chaos of the emergency room on a busy Friday night, the desperation that threatened to choke him with every thought of his son, of the accident, and of what had come before it. An argument over a career choice, over August's decision to pursue his art, his passion, full-time, instead of looking for work as an electrical engineer, a career that came with a college degree Harvey had paid for by working long hours and extra shifts. Angry words that escalated into insults and ultimatums, followed by threats and curses, and Harvey allowing himself to be provoked into assaulting his own beloved child. At last, tucked into a bed on the orthopedic ward, his ankle encased in a black titanium frame held in place with screws drilled through his flesh and into his bone, Harvey was alone. Overwhelmed by guilt and shame, by terrible regret and self-loathing, he wept. Pam had been in to see him, informing him that August was alive, but his prognosis wasn't good. A head trauma, she told him. They were having difficulty controlling the bleeding on his brain. When Harvey told her it was his fault, Pam tried her best to comfort him, insisting he not blame himself, that it was an accident, that there was nothing he could have done. But she didn't know. She didn't know the truth of what had happened. He turned away from her silent tears, her crumpled tissues, the terrible worry she tried to hide from him shining miserably from her puffy eyes. Finally, he'd told her he was tired and that she needed to go home and get some rest. She'd kissed his cheek and left, but not to go home. Instead, Pam had stayed by August's side through the night, through the next and the next, standing in the gap left by both of her nephew's absent parents. At first, Harvey visited the intensive care unit to see August every day, appalled by the sight of his boy, almost unrecognizable with his swollen, discolored features, the dressings wrapped tightly around his head, the tubes and lines moving fluids in and out of his body. Within days of the accident, the young man's naturally lean frame turned gaunt as he seemed to shrink before Harvey's eyes. My fault, my fault, my fault. When the medical care team told him that August was no longer progressing with treatment, that in fact he seemed to be giving up, shutting down, and that they wanted to move him to a long-term nursing facility, Harvey begged for more time, another opinion, someone who was willing to fight for the life of his son. An up-and-coming young neurosurgeon offered to perform an experimental procedure with no guarantee of success, and without even asking for details, Harvey leapt at the chance. And he prayed. He bargained with God, because in the pit of his gut, a boulder of guilt and regret lodged, and he gave in to the fear that he, Harvey, was the reason for his son's failure to thrive. Maybe somewhere in August's shrouded mind, the knowledge that he would have to return to the land of the living, to the man who had tried to kill him, was a really good reason for him to give up. Give my son back his life, and I'll go. I'll take myself out of the picture if that will make him choose life. I'd rather lose him, knowing he's all right, than to lose him like this, God." Harvey had kept his side of the bargain. He'd stayed away, watching his son's slow recovery from afar, gleaning what news he could from Pam. But in a brutal act of betrayal of both father and son, God had only kept part of his side of the bargain. August had indeed survived the surgery, but he'd survived without the life he'd once had. What kind of a God robbed an artist of his sight, took from him his ability to put pencil or paintbrush to paper? How fickle was God that he would create so much havoc inside August's head that the kid would crave darkness and solitude and stillness, when once upon a time all he'd wanted was wide-open spaces in which to create, to see the response on people's faces when they experienced his art, to hear the riotous noise of very loud music all the time. August, who ran like lightning for the sheer pleasure of it, and now could barely stand without support, who once communicated with his whole body, gesturing hands, tapping feet, bobbing head, non-stop conversation, who now held himself stiff and formal and reserved, lest he communicate all too well the turmoil inside his head. All the while, the efficient and determined Pam, who still called her nephew Augie, and gentle Will, who would lay down his life before he struck another living creature, still stood in the gap for August, for Harvey. But he felt certain that they were growing weary of it. According to the note he'd received, perhaps August was growing weary of it too. Dare he hope? Harvey tossed his wallet and keys into the circa 1970s wooden tray in the middle of his coffee table. In the kitchenette, he dumped the burrito along with a complimentary chips and salsa onto a paper plate and grabbed a can of RC from the fridge. He rarely drank anything stronger than soda these days, and the carbonated cola went well with Mexican food. He had just lowered himself to the couch and was flipping through the TV stations, still holding his untouched meal in the other hand, when his doorbell rang, the antiquated sound reminding him of an old alarm clock or bicycle bell. He muttered an oath under his breath, wondering if he'd get to eat before his food got cold, then muted the TV and pushed to his feet. Harvey froze as a different thought struck him. What if, oh mercy, what if it was August? He moved to the door with great effort, as though walking through quicksand. Chapter 4. "Hey, Harvey." Grace Winters greeted him with a bright smile. He didn't know whether to be relieved or irritated. "Hello, Grace." He leaned against his doorframe, not really surprised to see her. Just as he'd suspected, she'd had more to say to him after all. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're tired, but—" She spoke quickly, as though afraid he might try to stop her. "Have you eaten yet?"
"Aren't you supposed to be upstairs watching chick flicks with your sister?"
"We paused our movie." She shrugged. May I come in?" Harvey held back a long-suffering sigh.
"I was just sitting down to eat, and I only bought enough food for one."
Grace laughed, but she sounded nervous. "You're a funny guy, Harvey Jones. I'm not inviting myself in for dinner. She scrunched her face up a little, as though she knew her words were going to sound odd. Then she tried again. "I just need to talk to you."
"What is it, Miss Winters? I'm a tired old man just trying to turn in after a long day at work. I'm not used to this much attention from a pretty girl."
He smiled kindly, but he meant every word he said. He wanted to be alone with his quarrelsome thoughts, his burrito, and cold cola. "Okay." She squared her shoulders and took a steadying breath. I have something I want to tell you, but I'm just not sure that I should." Harvey shook his head, his brow furrowing in frustration.
"I repeat, I am tired. I am old. I'm not up to playing these games. Spit it out."
"I know your son, August." Well, spit it out she did. The air in the hallway reverberated with silence, and for a moment Harvey wanted to reach up and cover his ears. "And in so many ways," she added, "I feel like I know you too." That would explain her disconcerting familiarity with him. "August has told me so much about you. I should have recognized you immediately. I can see him in you, in your eyes, the shape of your face, your build." Harvey's throat tightened, his stomach knotted, and he wondered if he was going to be sick. Wouldn't that be a fancy trick? "Don't be angry," she whispered. She reached out and rested her hand on his forearm before hurrying on, her voice stronger, but anxious nonetheless. "I wanted to tell you right away. Really, I did. As soon as you introduced yourself, in fact. But I didn't know how, because I know you don't want, well, you know, you're not speaking at all." Harvey could feel his head swinging back and forth, but couldn't seem to make it stop. The weight of her words alone could have knocked him over, and he was grateful for the solidness of the doorframe at his back. He opened his mouth to speak, shut it, then opened it again, the words jumbling up at the back of his throat, pushing and shoving to get out. Only one word slipped past the band that squeezed around his vocal cords.
"August?"
Grace nodded, but said nothing, as though giving him time to gather his thoughts.
Is he here?"
The question sounded as strangled as he felt, but through his mind flashed the image of the note with a slashing signature. August. August. "Oh no," Grace said quickly, her words spilling out like a faucet opened a little too wide. "It's just me today. I mean, he doesn't live here in the apartments either, if that's what you're asking." She cocked her head and gave him an apologetic grimace. "I'm sorry if I shocked you, or offended you. I didn't mean to do either. It's just that I couldn't pretend, you know?" She shrugged again, something she seemed to do a lot of, Harvey noted. "I'm not good at pretending. What you see is what you get." Harvey squeezed his eyes shut. He wasn't angry at her, but he seemed to be having trouble getting enough oxygen to his brain. Reaching up, he pressed a thumb and forefinger to the hollows under his brows, willing himself to process the information she was doling out. "Are you okay?" Grace asked. He could hear her concern in the kindness of her voice. "Should I call someone for you? Help you inside?" Harvey opened his eyes and met her gaze squarely.
"I'm okay."
He nodded, trying to steady his voice so he sounded reassuring for both of their sakes.
"I'm just a little caught off guard, that's all."
He shoved his fingers through his thinning hair, leaving the wispy strands in a disarray, then gripped the back of his neck. Stepping back, he held open his door for her. The aching pressure around his heart made him wonder if inviting her in wasn't, in fact, a really bad idea. But he doggedly overrode the thought.
"Please, come in."
He gestured at the couch, the only seating in the living room.
"Can I offer you a soda? All I have is RC, or water."
"I haven't had an RC in ages," she chirped, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the can on the coffee table. "I'd love one."
"Have a seat, or I can bring over a kitchen chair if you'd rather."
"Oh no, Harvey." She smiled warmly. "I'm fine to share the couch with you. And I'm sorry I'm interrupting your meal." She frowned at his plate of untouched food on the coffee table as she settled into her seat. "I just couldn't stand another minute of our movie upstairs, knowing I'd kept you in the dark about me when I knew so much about you. It didn't feel right." She thanked him when he handed her a soda. Sarah agreed. Harvey wondered momentarily what she would have done if Sarah hadn't agreed. Would Grace have acted on her instincts anyway, or would she have let her sister sway her to do differently? But the question was quickly overridden by thoughts of August. He lowered himself to the edge of the couch and rested his elbows on his knees, trying to decide which question to ask first. There were at least 1,000 of them. Other than Pam and Will early on, he'd not spoken aloud to anyone about August for more than 2 years, and he had no idea where to begin.
How do you know him? How is he?
Grace hesitated for a moment, and Harvey thought she was measuring her words, carefully choosing which ones to say to him. Honestly, he's doing great. I mean, considering, things being what they are. She pointed at his plate. Please go ahead and eat, Harvey. I feel awful enough to have disrupted your night, and now you're going to be eating cold food.
It's fine. I'm fine, okay? I'll eat when I'm ready.
His words came out gruff, but he didn't want to discuss his food right now. He reached for the remote and powered off the muted sports channel before turning to look at her.
Are you one of his nurses or something?
Grace smiled softly, and Harry felt a snag catch somewhere in his chest at the unmistakable expression on her face. So that was how it was. This girl, his boy, there was something there, more than just knowing each other. But how had they ended up here, in his building? Surely it wasn't just coincidence.
How do you know him?
Harvey asked again, anxious for every missing piece of the puzzle. We met Christmas Eve, in that crazy Otis elevator, when he came to... She broke off, her face flushing. Then, as though making up her mind, she continued, I might as well tell you everything. It's not like I haven't already spilled most of the beans anyway. She shrugged again, and suddenly Harvey recognized the gesture for what it was, an apology, as though she felt the need to excuse her behavior, her words, perhaps her very presence. He wanted to tell her to stop it, that her lack of guile, her straightforwardness was refreshing. He said nothing, though, afraid to speak lest he sound too hungry, too desperate for information about his son, lest he scare her off and leave him with nothing. He came to see you, Harvey. You know that, right? She said, extending her hand toward him, then pulling it back quickly. She lifted beseeching eyes to his. He wanted to see you. He wants to see you. The words, presented so gently and with great care, still held a trace of censure, of chastisement.
I wasn't home,
Harvey murmured.
If I'd known.
Grace nodded encouragingly. If you'd known, she prompted.
I'd have been here.
The words were difficult to get out, but he cleared his throat and repeated them.
I would have been here, Grace. Had I known he was coming, I would have moved heaven and earth to be.
His voice broke, but he pushed the last word out anyway.
Here.
I knew it, she whispered, crossing her arms around her middle so it looked like she was hugging herself.
Does he...
Why was it so difficult to speak?
Who came with him?
Had Pam forgiven him too? He came alone, Grace said. His aunt, your sister, right? She dropped him off since he can't drive, but he came by himself. He wanted it to be just the two of you.
How did he find where I lived? Not the address or apartment number, of course. Pam would have told him. But how did he get up here, alone, without help? I mean, He
scrubbed the top of his head. He couldn't bring himself to say the word out loud.
He can't see, right?
Blind? Clearly, Grace didn't share the same hang-up. Legally, he is, yes, but he can see, Harvey, just not very well, especially with his peripheral vision. and sometimes it takes his brain a while to register what his eyes are seeing. He can explain it better than I can." She laced her fingers together in her lap and smiled down at them, momentarily lost in a thought that clearly made her happy. "He took the elevator that night. So did I. So did Lucy and Itzy. Do you know them? They moved in right after Thanksgiving last year, and Lucy just had a baby. A little boy, Ollie. He's so cute. Anyway, so technically he was there too." She held up an open hand. "The 5 of us got stuck in the elevator." Harvey nodded.
"I met Lucy and her daughter a few weeks ago. They were in the elevator when I came in at the end of the day and started for the stairs. Itzy, that's the little girl's name, right? She offered me a ride up, and I couldn't say no to her. She's a character, that one."
Harvey chuckled, remembering the way the pixie child had looked up at him with a combination of excitement and challenge in her eyes.
"I believe in you, mister," she said to me. This was before the baby, though.
Harvey frowned. His fists balled up automatically at the thought of Lucy's horrific ordeal the night she'd given birth last month.
"What became of that fellow who came after them? Do you know?"
"Her ex? You heard about that?" Grace's expression darkened and her mouth drew down in angry contempt. "He's locked up for a very long time, and good riddance. Not only is he a violent scumbag, but he was also involved in some major racketeering operations. A grade A pig's backside, a horse's hindquarters, a donkey's cousin. You get my drift." She didn't shrug, Harvey noticed. Good girl. He nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth at her obvious effort not to use foul language in describing the vile man. But he agreed with her completely.
"I get your drift."
He reached for his RC and took a quick sip to cool his own heated thoughts. The fact that the guy had managed to get inside the building uninvited was bad enough. But that he'd come with the intent to harm the tiny woman and her children turned his stomach the same way the memory of his own fist striking his son's cheek did.
"Actually, I was here that night he trapped her in the stairwell. By the time I stepped out into the hall to see what the commotion was, Pax and his buddies had everything under control."
"Oh, Pax was wonderful. A hero, you know. He stepped right in and took care of everything." She sighed dreamily, obviously impressed by the hulk of a man who lived down the hall.
"Pax is a good man. I'm glad he was there to help her out."
An ex-cop injured in the line of duty. He'd been too close when a meth lab blew. There wasn't anyone better equipped to handle the violent man who'd hunted Lucy and Itzy down. Although Pax had come a long way since the accident, he was still undergoing some major reconstructive surgery and was often away from the apartment complex for weeks at a time. Fortunately for Lucy, Pax had been home that terrible night in January. "Well, Itzy likes him, so he's got a thumbs up in my book." Grace grinned and nodded. "I love that kid. She's so real about everything. Do you know what she said to Pax about the scars on his neck and face?" She cupped a hand around her own neck, a gesture so tender Harvey had to look away for a moment. No wonder Grace had a soft spot for the little Itzy. She, too, was as genuine as they came. Grace Winters, who apparently had a soft spot for his beloved August, too.
"I can only imagine," he said in response to her question. "Tell me."
It occurred to him at that moment that he was actually beginning to enjoy the conversation with her. She somehow made it easy to respond to her, to interact with her. It was such a departure from his usual modus operandi of grunts and nods, of using as few words as possible at all times, that he found himself marveling over her. What was it about her that engaged him so readily? She told him he looked like he'd been fighting dragons. She wanted to know if he was a real knight in shining armor. She pressed a palm to her chest. "Now there's a girl after my own heart. already on the lookout for knights in shining armor willing to slay dragons for her. She pointed at him. "Did you know that Lucy writes romance novels up there? Isn't that cool? I wish I could write romance novels. Except," she paused to take a breath, "I don't think I could write any juicy bits, lovey-dovey stuff. You know what they say, write what you know." And wait for it. Yep, there it was. She shrugged.
"Nothing wrong with that, Grace," Harvey said, making sure not to let his parent voice loose on her. "Being inexperienced in love just means you're not selling out, not settling."
He and his beloved Carrie, August's mother, had been each other's first and only loves. Grace guffawed in a rather unladylike manner. "Or it means I scare any potential candidates away by my gargantuan epicness." She held up a foot for his inspection. "I wear my brother's shoes, Harvey, and he's only an inch taller than I am." She straightened her spine and lifted her chin so she could look down her nose at him. "I tower over most men, and they find it intimidating, period. It certainly doesn't help that I'm a lot, klutzy, which makes me a bit of a high-risk commitment. Would you want to have to catch me if I fell?" Harvey grinned, but knew better than to say anything. She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I saw the look on your face when I charged up the stairs to help you out front." Grace tucked her hands into tight fists between her knees, a gesture that came across as painfully self-conscious, even while she continued her self-deprecating diatribe. "I recognized the fear there, believe me. I do tend to throw my weight around, literally, but not with any malicious intent, you know."
"Stop, please."
This time it was Harvey who reached for Grace, his work-roughened hand on her shoulder.
He looked into her eyes and said, "Do you know what my second first impression of you was?"
"Your second first?"
"Yes, because you're right. You did scare me a little at first. In fact, you still do, a little."
He chuckled and was glad to see the answering humor in her expression.
"My second first impression of you was that you were lovely and feminine."
"Wow." Her voice was small, almost timid. "Really?"
"Really."
He nodded.
"And without guile, just like Itzy. Your openness and honesty are refreshing, Miss Winters."
"Why, Mr. Jones!" Grace pressed both palms to her chest now. "You have the soul of a romantic. My goodness."
"And you're tenacious,"
Harvey added, marveling again at how easy the words came with her, with this young woman he'd only met less than an hour ago. Yet the idea of speaking good things into someone's life, especially someone like Grace, felt remarkably edifying. "Are you calling me clingy, Mr. Jones?" Grace asked, cocking her head and shooting him a quirked eyebrow.
"No, Miss Winters. I'm calling you tenacious, resolute, unflagging."
He squeezed her shoulder before letting go of her, then scratched at his jaw. Man, he needed a shower and shave.
"All good things in my book."
She nodded slowly, and then said, "You really thought all those things about me?" She was still smiling, but in a way that made her look vulnerable and small in spite of her striking stature.
"I did. I do."
He paused, making sure she was really hearing him.
"You're also kind, Grace. Thank you."
Grace shook her head, clearly bemused by his words. "For what? For keeping you from your dinner with my blabbermouth?"
"Thank you for being real with me, for not withholding about August."
He flicked at some imaginary dust on his pants.
"For being kind to an old man who doesn't deserve kindness, especially from someone who loves my son."
Harvey grinned when Grace's whole body twitched. August and I, we just met," she stammered. We're just friends. I mean, I care about him. I love him in a friend way, I suppose. He's a really wonderful person, but not like that, if you know what I mean." She thrust out a hand in a halting gesture. "Not that I couldn't love him, or wouldn't. Don't get me wrong. I could if I wanted to." She waved her hand like she was trying to erase her words from the air between them. "Not that I don't want to either. No, wait, that sounded even worse. I might want to, maybe someday, but, oh geez, I just need to stop talking." She brought her hands to her bright pink cheeks. "What were you saying, Harvey?" Chapter 5. By this time, Harvey was laughing, not at Grace and her unbridled thoughts about his son, although he was certainly getting a kick out of her. No, he was laughing from what he could only describe as a surge of joy, foreign and utterly unexpected on this dreary, weary workday, welling up inside him at the discovery of this girl, this serendipitous link to all that he'd lost. For certainly, the word fit after all, didn't it? "Don't laugh at me. I can't bear it." She moved her hands to cover her eyes.
"Grace Winters, look at me."
Harvey touched her elbow, waiting for her to peek out at him through the openings between her fingers. The yearning of a father coursed through him, her childlike reaction endearing her even more to him.
"You have made me laugh, but not at you. It's because you've brought me joy. You, my dear, brought me news of my son."
His chest tightened in anticipation at the words. If what she said was true, and he believed her, he did, then he'd be reuniting with August in no time at all.
"This isn't one of those TV pranks, is it?" he asked, only half joking. "There aren't any hidden cameras or film crews lurking in the hallway or anything like that, right?"
"Oh, Harvey, no." She shook her head vehemently, frowning at the mere idea of it. "I'd never play games with people's broken hearts. Not ever." Her frown deepened for a moment. "Although I honestly don't know how August will feel about me talking to you like this. I hope he doesn't see it as a betrayal of his trust. Maybe I should have asked him first." She lifted her shoulders, not in a shrug this time, but in the act of taking a fortifying breath. "Oh well, I guess I'll just have to face the consequences, because I know I was supposed to tell you about him." She made a fist and thumped it against her sternum a few times. "In here. I just know this was supposed to happen, us meeting tonight." She shot him a teasing look. "You know, serendipity and all."
"August will understand, Grace."
Harvey spoke with certainty, remembering the tender-hearted boy his son once was, the quietly courageous teenager August had been in the wake of his mother's untimely death, and the sensitive artist he'd blossomed into during his college years and after.
"If he really does want to reconnect—"
"He does, Harvey," Grace insisted, interrupting him with her vehemence. "He really does want to see you. From what he's told me about his condition, he's come a long way, but he still has some major hurdles to jump if he's going to be independent." She pressed her hands together in front of her as though in prayer or petition. "I just know that fixing the broken things between you two would be a game changer for him." She sighed and lowered her hands. And she shrugged. "I'm going to be super honest with you, okay? Because why not? I've kind of told you everything already, right?" Her cheeks pinked up again and she spoke hesitantly. "It might, just possibly, be a game changer for me, for us, too. I think somewhere in that amazing brain of his, he's not sure he's good enough for me, or whole enough, you know?" She grinned, but it was a terribly sad grin. "Because, well, I do want to love him, Harvey. I really do. I think I'm falling in love with August." She released a long breath. "There, I said it out loud. Whew!" She fanned her flushed cheeks with her hand for a moment, and then added softly, "But he won't let me." Harvey nodded, his heart breaking for August all over again, and also for this lovely young woman who walked around like an open book. But he wasn't going to make empty promises or speak for his son, and he wasn't going to force love where it might not take root. As though she read his mind, she said, "Don't misunderstand me, Harvey. I'm not asking you to speak to him for me." She dropped her gaze to her feet. With the toe of her shoe, she had made small patterns in the toffee-colored carpet. "In fact, please don't. I don't think I could handle that either. I just want him to be happy, to find peace in his corner of the world. And I think he needs his father for that."
"Maybe he needs you for that,"
Harvey countered, somehow certain in his gut that it was true. Grace let out a sound that might have been a chuckle, and she shook her head. "I don't think so. But you know, Harvey, right now, I'm more than willing to wait until he's ready to want me, because there are just some things a person knows, you know? And I know, right here." She thumped her fist against her chest again. "I know he's good enough. He's whole enough. He's more than enough for me. I may not love him yet. How do you know so quickly? But I know I can. I would, if he'd let me." Was his son really so blind that he couldn't see the heart of this girl? She didn't just wear it on her sleeve. She wore it like a crown, a beacon, drawing people to her. One couldn't look at Grace Winters without becoming smitten with her heart. Harvey rested his hand on her shoulder again.
"Your secret is safe with me, I promise."
He wasn't going to speak for August, but he added,
"And if August can't find his way to you, don't be afraid to be tenacious with him, too, you hear? Grab onto him like you did to me."
He bent his arm between them like he was offering it to her, and then kindly, carefully, used her words to prod her into action.
"And then don't be afraid to throw your weight around a little. A real man, a whole man, may not know he can catch you until he has to step up and do it."
Grace frowned and shook her head slowly. "I don't want to push him or scare him." She crossed her arms again and rubbed her palms up and down her biceps. "I can be a little overwhelming if I'm not careful. Often, I don't realize I'm coming on too strong until it's too late. Besides, I really am a disaster waiting to happen. I tend to hurt people, at least physically. I practically crushed his toes the night we met, and I was just standing there." After a moment, Harvey turned a look of consternation on her.
"Wait a minute, Grace. You're telling me he's whole enough for you, he's enough. No, you said he's more than enough for you just the way he is."
He waited for her hesitant nod before continuing.
"Then, in the next breath, you tell me you don't want to scare him, you don't want to overwhelm him, you don't want to push him or hurt him."
Well, yes. There went that apologetic shoulder lift again. He didn't think she even realized she did it. He is enough for me, more than enough. But I know he needs to sort through some stuff first before he can focus on a relationship with a woman. With me, she amended with a shy smile. And until he's ready, I don't want to make things harder on him than they already are. He's got a lot on his shoulders, you know?" Harvey nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a straight line. He was finding it difficult not being just the smallest bit offended on behalf of August. Finally, he said,
"Okay, so let me see if I got this straight."
He held out both hands, palms up. Lifting first his left hand higher, he said,
"With your words, you say he's enough, whole just the way he is. Wonderful."
He raised his right hand.
"But with your actions, Your attitude, you tell him he's weak. You treat him like he's an invalid who needs special handling."
He bobbled his hands up and down like a balance scale.
"Something doesn't compute, Grace."
"But I don't," Grace started. "He just needs more time."
"When will he be ready then?"
It was Harvey's turn to interrupt her.
"How much more time does he need? And is it your place to make that decision for him?"
"Of course not, nor am I making it." Her hackles were up, he could tell, not just in the tone of her voice, but also in the way she went completely still, as though poised for fight or flight. "He's the one setting the pace. I'm just letting him."
For the sake of beating a dead horse, let me say it a little differently. He doesn't think he's good enough or whole enough for you, so he's holding back because he needs more time to become enough. You say he's already good enough and whole enough for you now, and you could or would or want to love him, whichever it is, but you're okay with waiting until he's ready.
Grace nodded slowly. "Right?" She drew the word out into multiple syllables. She still wasn't quite getting it. He spoke gently, wanting her to understand without feeling criticized. Her heart was in the right place, but she wasn't seeing the big picture.
"Don't you see, Grace? Your actions speak louder than your words, and your actions are saying that you agree with him."
Harvey waited for it to register. And then it did. "Oh, I never really thought about it like that."
Treat him like a wounded animal. He'll act like one, Grace. Treat him like a whole person, a man who's got what it takes to catch you when you fall, and he'll become that man, I guarantee you. I know my son. I know what he's made of. I know beneath the tragedy of this accident and all it's done to him, to all of us, that he's in there begging to be asked to rise to the occasion.
He did know August, he realized as he said the words out loud. He knew the boy he'd raised to be a man, the son any father would be proud to claim.
Don't you see, Grace? August doesn't need people to pull away or keep their distance from him. A man needs his loved ones to walk beside him, not behind him, to challenge him to get back up when he falls. You think you might be falling in love with my son? Then show some of that tenacity and determination I've already seen in you. Don't stand back and wait while he faces his demons alone. Jump into the fray and fight alongside him. Let him know you've got his back, that you're not going to abandon him no matter what. That's what August needs."
Everything inside Harvey's spirit emptied out in that moment, leaving him a breathless, hollow shell, gutted to the marrow of his being by his own words. Hadn't he done those very things? In bargaining with God, no, in playing God, Harvey had abandoned his son when he needed his father the most. He'd pulled away and kept his distance when August had walked through the shadowed valley of death, forcing his son to battle his demons alone in his darkest hours. He'd walked so far behind August for the last 2 years, for the last several years if he was going to be honest about it, that Harvey had lost sight of his son's heart. All along, Harvey had accused God of not holding up his end of the bargain, as though God had agreed to any of it in the first place. All this time, he'd believed God had betrayed them, had punished August for the sins of his father. But it had been he, Harvey Jones, who'd walked away, who'd abandoned the fight, who'd gone undercover to lick his wounds while leaving his son alone in the dark. It had been Harvey who had failed in his role as faithful father, not God. And in spite of Harvey's faithlessness, God, it seemed, was offering him the gift of grace. Harvey closed his eyes, and a single tear made a hot track down his cheek into the scruff that shadowed his jaw. Grace. How could such a small word hold a universe of hope in its single syllable? Bigger than life, gargantuan, Amazonian Grace. Clumsy, perhaps, but guileless and true, tenacious and resolute. The girl sitting on the couch beside him was the personification, the embodiment of her name. "You're right," Grace whispered. "You're so right. I've been so blind." She broke off and let out a choked laugh. "Poor choice of words. I'm sorry."
No, no.
Harvey shook his head and reached for her hand.
We've all been stumbling around in the dark, I think. I have especially.
The lump in his throat threatened to strangle him, but he swallowed hard and continued.
"Will he see me, Grace?"
He suddenly needed to hear her say it again.
"Can he forgive me?"
Grace cocked her head, frowning. "Forgive you? Harvey, he's hoping you will forgive him." Chapter 6. Harvey stared at Grace in disbelief.
"I don't understand. Why would I need to forgive August? I'm the one at fault. I'm the guilty party. It's my fault things are what they are today."
He released her hand and pushed up from the couch, unable to sit still a moment longer. His voice grew louder with his agitation.
"Me forgive him? All this time he's thought I was angry at him?"
"Harvey, please." Grace stood too, one hand outstretched in supplication. "I obviously don't know all that's gone on between you, so I should be more careful with what I say. What I know is that he wants to make things right between you, if you're willing." She sat back down on the edge of the cushion and folded her hands demurely in her lap. "Yes, absolutely he'll see you. You have his number, don't you?"
"He left it for me."
Harvey crossed to the refrigerator and slipped August's note from under a magnet. He held it pressed between his palms, and for a moment he thought it felt warm, like a living, breathing extension of his son.
"He slipped this under the door, presumably Christmas Eve. He said he wanted to see me."
"He told me about it," Grace said, a soft smile on her face. "I'm glad you got it, and kept it." Her eyes were bright with what he suspected were unshed tears. "Call him, Harvey."
"I'm not as brave as August is,"
Harvey began.
I don't know. I don't know what to say to him."
Grace acknowledged his hesitation without judgment. "I don't think it matters what words you say, Harvey. He just wants to hear your voice. See your—" The arpeggio trill of a phone interrupted her, and time slowed down as she twisted in her seat so she could pull it from her back pocket. Harvey knew before she looked at her screen, before she lifted her wide eyes to his. He knew before she whispered the name. August. He nodded and gestured for her to answer it. She rose and moved toward the door. Harvey opened it for her, and she stepped out into the hall. As he closed it behind her, he heard her say, "Hey, you! You'll never believe where I am right now." No more than 5 interminable minutes later, there was a light tap on his door. Grace, her phone now pressed to her chest, whispered, "He wants to come over tomorrow evening. Will that work for you?" Harvey couldn't speak past the lump still lodged in his throat, so he nodded. The muscles around his mouth tightened, the bridge of his nose tingled, and the breath caught in his lungs. Tears welled up and spilled over, but he kept nodding even after Grace had slipped back out into the hall again.
"Yes, yes, yes! My son, August!"
When Grace reappeared a few moments later, her cheeks too were glistening with tears. She crossed the room, and without preamble, she wrapped her arms around Harvey. She simply held him while he wept, his whole body trembling with the long overdue release of emotions. She stood stalwart and strong, sturdy, resolute. Solid ground on which to find his footing, an anchor in a sea of crashing waves. No wonder August was drawn to her. Harvey finally pulled away, slightly embarrassed, but flooded with peace and gratitude. He made his way into the little kitchen to blow his nose on a napkin.
"Forgive me,"
he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Please don't apologize for your tears, Harvey. They make me like you even more than I did 10 minutes ago." She swiped at her own cheeks with her fingertips, leaving a dark smudge of makeup from the corner of her left eye up toward her temple. He just smiled at her delightful humanness, liking her even more than he had 10 minutes ago as well. "I'm going to head back upstairs now," Grace said after a few moments. "Are you going to be all right?" Harvey nodded emphatically.
"I'm more than all right. I'm overwhelmed by Grace."
He chuckled at his own play on words.
"Go and enjoy your sister time, Miss Winters. Please say hello to Sarah for me."
He pulled open the door for her again. Grace pointed at the chili relleno burrito growing cold on the coffee table. "And you eat your dinner, Mr. Jones." She paused in the doorway and turned to face him, her eyes wide, her smile earnest. "I really, really want to know how things go tomorrow, and I know that makes me a nosy busybody, but would you? Maybe you could—"
"I'll tell August to call you, I promise."
He grinned at the look of sheer delight on her face, and then laughed out loud when she lurched forward to hug him tightly, nearly knocking them both over. In the hall, she turned one last time, grinning impishly at him. "Tell me you don't believe in serendipity now, Mr. Jones. I dare you. I mean, that phone call? You have to believe." Harvey shrugged, perhaps apologetically. She really was growing on him.
"I do believe, Miss Winters."
"I knew it," she declared. Harvey held up a hand to cut her off.
"I believe, Miss Winters," he repeated, "in the gift of grace. But then, aren't they kind of the same thing? Grace and serendipity? When joy is born out of misery, when good overcomes bad. Isn't that simply God granting us undeserved favor? It's grace, when all is said and done, don't you think?"
"You know, Mr. Jones?" Grace spread her arms and twirled slowly, her smile effervescent. "Tonight, I really, really love my name." With a hand held up to her ear, pinky finger and thumb extended, she said, "I'll be waiting for a call." Then she pushed open the door to the stairwell and was gone. We hope you've enjoyed our production of The Faithful Father, Pemberton Manor, Book 3, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2017 by Becky Dowdy. Production copyright 2022 by Becky Dowdy. This is a Brave Hearts Press audio production.